At exactly 9:47 p.m., Danielle Coleman unlocked the door to her tiny apartment after working a double shift. Sitting on the cold concrete outside were two soaked little twins clutching three crumpled blue paper airplanes as if they were the only things keeping them alive. The little boy whispered through chattering teeth, "Daddy will find us." Danielle had no idea who they were or why they had chosen her door. 30 days later, just hours before she and her own son were about to be evicted, a black sedan stopped outside. An elderly chauffeur knocked softly and asked one question that made her heart stop. "Ma'am, do you still have the three paper airplanes? Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Leave it in the comments so we can see how far this story travels." And if stories about kindness, courage, and unexpected hope speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining us for more. Every weekday began long before the sun considered rising. At 5:30 a.m., Danielle Coleman was already unlocking the side entrance of Lincoln Elementary School in Cleveland, Ohio. The building was silent except for the distant hum of heating vents and the squeak of her worn sneakers against polished hallways. She carried the same faded blue cleaning cart every morning, stopping first in the kindergarten wing, because as she often told herself, little children deserved to arrive somewhere that smelled clean and felt safe. She emptied trash bins, wiped fingerprints from classroom windows, straightened tiny chairs, and carefully placed crayons back into their containers whenever teachers forgot. Nobody had asked her to organize the crayons. Danielle simply believed children noticed kindness in small things, long before they understood grand gestures. At exactly 7:15, she always paused outside room 103. Mrs. Alvarez, the kindergarten teacher, would smile as she unlocked her classroom. "Morning, Danielle." "Morning." "You cleaned my whiteboard again." It looked lonely. The teacher laughed every single day at the same joke. Those little routines made the exhausting mornings easier. By 9:30, Danielle's first shift ended. She climbed into her 15-year-old silver Honda Civic. The heater barely worked unless she kicked the dashboard twice. The passenger side window no longer rolled down. The gas gauge stayed stubbornly below a quarter tank because filling it completely had become a luxury months ago. She checked her wallet before turning the key. $23. That had to last until Friday. She whispered the same sentence she had spoken almost every morning for the past year. "We'll make it." The "we" always meant two people. She and her 8-year-old son, Ethan. When Danielle arrived home shortly before 10, Ethan was already sitting at the tiny kitchen table, finishing his homework from the after-school program. He looked up with an enormous grin. "I made breakfast." Breakfast consisted of 2 slices of toast cut into 4 triangles and scrambled eggs from the last 2 eggs in the refrigerator. Danielle pretended not to notice there was more food on her plate than his. "You cooked again." "I practiced." "You mean you burned less this time?" He laughed. "I only burned 1 piece." She reached over and rubbed his curly hair. "That's progress." The apartment was barely 600 square feet. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. A kitchen so small that opening the refrigerator blocked half the doorway. The wallpaper near the sink had started peeling months ago after a pipe leaked behind the wall. Danielle kept promising herself she would fix it when she had extra money. Extra money never came. Instead, bills continued arriving. Electricity, water, car insurance, school supplies. Every envelope seemed heavier than the last. The one she feared most sat beneath a ceramic fruit bowl on the kitchen counter. The overdue rent notice. She unfolded it after breakfast. Past due $642. Payment required within 7 days. Failure to pay may result in eviction proceedings. She folded it again before Ethan could see. Children noticed far more than adults imagined. Ethan quietly packed his backpack. "Mom?" "Yeah." Are we okay? Danielle forced the warmest smile she could manage. We've been through harder. It wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't entirely false either. After walking Ethan to the neighborhood library's after-school learning program, Danielle drove across town for her second job. Rosie's diner sat beside an old railroad crossing where freight trains still rolled through every evening. The diner had faded, red booths, chipped coffee mugs, and customers who rarely looked at the waitresses unless their coffee cups were empty. Danielle liked it anyway. The owner, Rosie Miller, treated everyone fairly. When a customer complained loudly about cold fries, Rosie always apologized first and defended her staff afterward. You can't teach honesty, Rosie often said, but you can hire it. Danielle appreciated those words more than Rosie realized. Her evening shift stretched from 4 until nearly 9. Some nights she left with $60 in tips. Other nights barely 15. That Thursday was one of the bad nights. Heavy rain had kept most customers home. By closing time, Danielle counted $18.40 in tips. Rosie looked at the total and sighed. You take the leftover chicken soup. I can pay. I didn't ask if you could. Danielle hesitated. Accepting charity had never come easily. Rosie pushed the container into her hands. I'm closing in 5 minutes. If you leave it here, it'll go in the trash. Danielle finally nodded. Thank you. Just promise me you'll eat some too. I will. She almost meant it. Outside, cold rain bounced off the parking lot beneath flickering streetlights. The windshield wipers struggled against the downpour as Danielle drove toward home. The radio forecast warned that temperatures would drop close to freezing before midnight. She worried about people without somewhere warm to sleep. She always did. Halfway home, she stopped at the neighborhood grocery store. She studied prices more carefully than most people read contracts. Milk, bread, peanut butter, bananas. She calculated every dollar in her head before placing anything into the basket. At checkout, the total flashed across the screen. $31.12. Danielle quietly removed the bananas, then the peanut butter, finally the milk. The cashier looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. Danielle smiled gently. It's okay. She paid for bread and pasta instead. Simple meals stretched farther. As she stepped back into the rain, carrying 2 small grocery bags and Rosie's container of soup, she noticed a little girl staring at the display of stuffed animals near the entrance. The child's mother pulled her away. Maybe next birthday. Danielle smiled to herself. Children dreamed in simple ways. Adults forgot how. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain blurred the streetlights into golden streaks. By the time Danielle parked outside her apartment building, her shoulders ached and every muscle begged for sleep. She gathered the grocery bags, balanced the soup container under one arm, and hurried toward the entrance. Her old wristwatch read exactly 9:47 p.m. Wind pushed icy rain beneath the porch roof. She searched her purse for the apartment key. As the lock clicked open, she heard something. Not knocking, not crying, almost breathing, very softly. She turned toward the far corner of the porch. At first, she thought someone had left 2 bags of laundry against the wall. Then one of them moved. 2 tiny children sat curled together beneath a soaked gray blanket. A little boy held 3 crumpled blue paper airplanes tightly against his chest. Beside him, a little girl leaned weakly against his shoulder, her lips trembling from the cold. Both children looked no older than 4. Their clothes were drenched, their sneakers were muddy. Their frightened eyes lifted toward Danielle as though they had been waiting for only one person in the world. She slowly knelt, setting the groceries on the wet concrete. Hey. Her voice barely rose above the rain. It's okay. The little girl didn't answer. The little boy clutched the paper airplanes even tighter. Danielle carefully removed her own coat and wrapped it around both children. Their small bodies shivered beneath the heavy fabric. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "I'm calling someone who can help." The boy looked directly into her eyes. His voice was almost too quiet to hear. "Daddy." He glanced down at the 3 blue paper airplanes. "Will find us." The police officers stayed for nearly an hour. By the time they finished asking questions, the rain had softened into a cold drizzle that tapped gently against Danielle Coleman's apartment windows. Officer Karen Mitchell knelt in front of the twins one last time. "Can you tell me your last name?" The little girl lowered her eyes. The little boy silently shook his head. "Do you know your address?" "Nothing." "Grandma's name?" No answer. Every question ended the same way. Silence. Except for one. Officer Mitchell pointed to the 3 blue paper airplanes resting carefully on Danielle's coffee table. "What are those?" The little boy immediately reached for them, holding all 3 tightly against his chest. His lips finally moved. "Daddy will find us." Those 4 words were the only complete sentence either child had spoken all evening. The officers exchanged worried glances. Trauma could do strange things to children. Sometimes memories disappeared. Sometimes language disappeared. Sometimes the mind clung to one single promise because it was the only thing that still felt safe. Officer Mitchell stood. "We'll file them as unidentified minors." Danielle looked from the children to the officer. "What happens tonight? The emergency shelter is full. And foster placement. Not until Child Protective Services can process everything tomorrow." She hesitated before continuing. "We could separate them temporarily." The word separated changed everything. The little girl immediately wrapped both arms around her brother. He did the same. Danielle saw genuine terror spread across their tiny faces. "No," the boy whispered. "No." Officer Mitchell sighed quietly. "They've reacted like this every time we've mentioned different locations." Danielle looked toward the hallway where Ethan had been listening. Her son slowly stepped into the living room. He carried his favorite blanket. Without saying anything, he placed it around both children. The little girl looked up at him. After several long seconds, she accepted the blanket. It was the first time either child had accepted anything from someone they didn't already know. Officer Mitchell noticed. "They seem calmer around you." Danielle gave a tired smile. "I think they're just exhausted." The officer nodded. "Would you be willing to keep them tonight?" Danielle froze. She looked around her tiny apartment. 1 bedroom, 1 old sofa, a folding mattress she occasionally used when Ethan's cousin visited. The refrigerator contained half a loaf of bread, leftover chicken soup, a carton of eggs, and not much else. She was already struggling to feed 1 child. Now there would be 3. Before she could answer, Ethan spoke. "They can stay." Danielle looked at him. "Ethan, they're scared." He glanced toward the twins. "They don't have anywhere." His voice wasn't dramatic, it was matter of fact. The kind of simple truth children often understood better than adults. Officer Mitchell gently interrupted. "It would only be temporary. Probably a couple of days." Danielle looked once more at the frightened little faces. Then she slowly nodded. "They can stay." Relief washed across the officer's face. "I'll return first thing tomorrow with Child Protective Services." After signing several temporary emergency forms, the officers finally left. Silence filled the apartment. The twins stood awkwardly near the doorway, unsure whether they were guests or simply waiting to leave again. Danielle crouched until she was at eye level. "I'm Danielle." She pointed toward herself. "Danielle." Then she pointed toward her son. "This is Ethan." The little girl stared. The little boy looked at Ethan. Ethan smiled. "I'm 8. No response. "I like dinosaurs." Still nothing. "I don't like broccoli." The little girl's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Danielle noticed. So did Ethan. He quietly walked into his bedroom. A minute later, he returned, carrying an old stuffed elephant with one floppy ear. "I don't really sleep with him anymore." He carefully placed it beside the little girl. "You can borrow him." She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked toward her brother. He gave the smallest nod. Only then did she gently hug the elephant against her chest. Danielle felt tears sting her eyes. Trust wasn't built through speeches. Sometimes it arrived in the form of an old toy. A few minutes later, she reheated the chicken soup Rosie had given her. The apartment filled with the comforting smell of carrots, onions, celery, and herbs. She placed 4 bowls on the tiny kitchen table. The twins hesitated. Neither touched the food. Danielle picked up her own spoon first. "So everyone knows it's safe," she smiled. "It's really good." Ethan exaggerated his first bite. The best soup ever." The little boy cautiously tasted one spoonful, then another. Within minutes, both children were eating quietly. Not quickly, not desperately, just carefully, as if they had been taught never to waste food. Danielle noticed something else. The little girl broke pieces of bread in half. She always gave the larger half to her brother. The boy did the same, each secretly trying to leave more for the other. Danielle recognized that habit immediately. She and Ethan had done the same thing for years. After dinner came the next problem: sleeping arrangements. Danielle spread blankets across the living room floor. "I'll sleep out here." Ethan frowned. "No." "You take the couch?" "I'll sleep on the floor." Danielle shook her head. "You have school." "So do they someday." She laughed softly. "Nice try." Finally, they compromised. Danielle would take the floor. The twins would sleep on the couch. Ethan would stay in the bedroom. Before lying down, the little boy carefully unfolded all 3 blue paper airplanes. Despite being soaked earlier, he smoothed every wrinkle with incredible patience. Each fold seemed precious. The little girl helped flatten one damaged wing. Together they placed all 3 airplanes on the windowsill, perfectly aligned, side by side. Only after doing that did they climb beneath the blankets. Danielle watched quietly. There was ritual in the movement, something they had clearly done many times before. She waited until the room grew quiet. Then she whispered gently, "Why do you always put them there?" The little boy looked toward the airplanes. His tired eyes reflected the streetlight outside. "So Daddy," he paused, "can see." The little girl added, barely above a whisper, "They fly home." Danielle looked toward the dark window. The paper airplanes cast tiny shadows against the glass. She didn't know who their father was. She didn't know where he might be. She didn't even know the children's names yet. But she knew one thing. Somewhere someone had once folded those airplanes with love. Children did not guard ordinary pieces of paper that carefully. They guarded memories, promises, hope. Long after the apartment fell silent, Danielle remained awake. The overdue rent notice still rested beneath the fruit bowl. $642. 2 jobs, 1 son. Now 2 frightened little strangers. Nothing about the situation made practical sense. Yet every time she considered what might have happened if she hadn't come home when she did, she looked again at the 3 blue paper airplanes on the windowsill. Outside, a gentle breeze slipped through the cracked frame. The paper wings trembled slightly, but they didn't fall. Just before sleep finally claimed her, Danielle made a quiet promise to herself. Until someone proved they belonged somewhere else, those children would never have to wonder whether they had a safe place to wake up. 31 days earlier, While Danielle Coleman was trying to stretch $23 into another week of survival, a man nearly 100 miles away was spending millions without buying a single night's sleep. Jonathan Carter stood alone inside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office overlooking downtown Cleveland. The city glittered beneath him. Traffic flowed. Restaurants buzzed with laughter. Office towers slowly turned dark as employees headed home. Life continued exactly as it should, except inside the Carter family. The 48th floor felt like a museum now. Perfect furniture, perfect artwork, perfect silence. Jonathan loosened his tie, but never removed it. He had developed strange habits over the past month. Every morning he dressed as though he were going to an important meeting, even when every meeting had been canceled. Every evening he returned to an empty penthouse and sat in the same leather chair facing two untouched bedrooms. He refused to close their doors. As long as they remained open, part of him could pretend Mason and Mia might run through the hallway at any moment. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Michael Hayes entered, carrying another thick investigation folder. The former homicide detective looked older than he had a month earlier. Lack of sleep had carved deep lines beneath his eyes. Jonathan didn't need to ask. He already recognized the expression. "No." Michael slowly placed the folder on the desk. "We tracked 3 more reported sightings." "Were any of them real?" Michael shook his head. "One was another pair of twins. The second report came from someone hoping for the reward. The third was a misunderstanding at a shopping mall." Jonathan closed his eyes. Every false lead hurt more than the last. Not because of wasted money, because every phone call began with hope and ended with another door closing. "I've increased the reward to $5 million, Jonathan said quietly. "It isn't about the money anymore." "I know." Michael sat across from him. "I've worked missing child cases for 22 years. "The first month is usually the hardest." Jonathan stared toward the city lights. "Don't tell me to stay hopeful." "I wasn't going to." "Then what?" Michael leaned forward. "I'm going to tell you something else." Jonathan finally looked at him. "The children are alive until we have evidence they aren't." Silence settled between them. Jonathan nodded almost imperceptibly. "I repeat that sentence every morning." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Carefully, almost reverently, he removed a small blue paper airplane. Unlike an ordinary folded piece of paper, this one had been reinforced along the wings with transparent tape. Tiny fingerprints still marked its edges from hundreds of little hands folding and unfolding it over the years. Michael had seen Jonathan hold it countless times. He never grew used to the sight. "You still carry it?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "They each carried one." "I carried the 4th. He slowly ran his thumb along one folded wing. "It started because of a rainy Saturday." Michael remained quiet. He had learned that memories sometimes mattered more than questions. "Mason wanted to fly a real airplane." Jonathan chuckled softly. "He was 4. He thought if birds could do it, people should be able to as well. Mia said paper airplanes were easier." The tiny smile disappeared, so we spent the whole afternoon folding them. 4 airplanes. 1 for each of us." He looked toward the paper airplane in his hand. "I told them something that day." Michael already knew the story. Jonathan repeated it anyway. "No matter where you are, if you keep your paper airplane safe." His voice broke. "Daddy will always find you." For the first time in weeks, tears filled his eyes. Not dramatic tears, not loud sobbing, just quiet grief from a father replaying one sentence over and over, wondering if his own promise had become his children's only source of hope. Across town, the same words had become the only sentence Mason would speak. Neither man knew it. At exactly the same moment, they were connected by 3 folded pieces of blue paper. A buzz came through the office intercom. Jonathan quickly composed himself. "Yes." his longtime assistant answered. "Mr. Brooks is here." Jonathan glanced at the clock. Nearly 9:30. "Send him in." Seconds later, Samuel Brooks stepped into the office. At 58, Samuel had driven for the Carter family for more than 2 decades. He had driven Jonathan to his first investor meeting, to his wedding, to the hospital on the days both twins were born. He wasn't simply an employee anymore. He was family. Samuel noticed the paper airplane immediately. "You've still got it." Jonathan looked down. "I always will." Samuel walked towards the window. "I drove past the lake tonight." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "The park?" Samuel nodded. "I remembered taking Mason and Mia there last spring. They insisted every paper airplane had to be tested." A faint laugh escaped Jonathan. Mason thought distance was everything. "And Mia cared if they landed softly." Samuel smiled at the memory. "They argued for 20 minutes over which one won." Jonathan looked out across the skyline. "I'd give everything I own to hear that argument again." Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a folded notebook from his jacket pocket. "I've been thinking." Jonathan turned. "I know Michael has investigators. I know the police have officers. But they're searching like professionals." "What does that mean?" Samuel took a deep breath. "Professionals look at reports. Children leave habits." Jonathan frowned slightly. Samuel continued. "Mason never walked into a church without ringing the bell rope if they had one. Mia waved at every bus driver. They both loved free community events because someone always handed them balloons. And every Saturday." He pointed toward the paper airplane. "They carried those." Jonathan's expression slowly changed. Samuel had known the twins since birth. He noticed details others ignored. "I'd like to drive." Jonathan looked confused. "Drive where?" "Everywhere. Churches, community centers, soup kitchens, public libraries, parks, anywhere children might feel safe." Michael crossed his arms. "You think they'll behave normally after everything that's happened?" Samuel answered without hesitation. "No. I think they'll behave like frightened children. And frightened children are drawn to kindness." The room became quiet. Jonathan slowly folded the paper airplane once more and placed it carefully back inside his jacket. For the first time in weeks, his eyes held something different. Not certainty, not relief, just the smallest spark of direction. He looked at Samuel. "Then don't search for clues." Samuel waited. "Search for my children." The older man nodded once. "I'll leave at sunrise." Jonathan walked him to the office door. As Samuel reached for the handle, Jonathan called after him. "If you find even one paper airplane," Samuel turned, "bring me to them." The first Monday after Mason and Mia arrived felt longer than any day Danielle Coleman could remember. She woke before dawn, not because her alarm rang, but because she heard quiet footsteps in the hallway. For a brief moment, panic rushed through her. She thought the children had wandered outside. Instead, she found Mia standing in front of the apartment window. The little girl was staring into the dark parking lot. One small hand rested on the glass. The other held one of the blue paper airplanes. Danielle approached slowly. "Couldn't sleep?" Mia nodded without turning around. After a long silence, she whispered the first complete sentence Danielle had heard from her. "What if Daddy comes while I'm sleeping?" Danielle's heart tightened. She knelt beside the child. "If he comes," she gently tucked a loose curl behind Mia's ear, "I'll wake you." Mia finally looked at her. "You promise?" "I promise." The little girl carefully placed the paper airplane back beside the other two on the windowsill before climbing back onto the couch. Danielle remained there for several minutes, looking at the 3 folded airplanes silhouetted against the first hint of morning light. They had become more than paper. They were hope folded into wings. By 6 o'clock, the apartment was buzzing with unfamiliar routines. Ethan showed Mason how to brush his teeth without wasting toothpaste. "You only need this much." He squeezed out a tiny amount. "My mom says toothpaste costs money." Mason copied him carefully. When breakfast came, Danielle divided 1 box of oatmeal into 4 bowls. Nobody complained. Nobody asked for more. Even Ethan seemed to understand that sharing had become part of their family overnight. As Danielle buttoned her cleaning uniform, another worry surfaced. Child Protective Services had called. The investigation was still ongoing. No missing person report matched the twins. No fingerprints, no identification, no relatives, no school records, nothing. The social worker apologized over the phone. "We're overwhelmed right now. There are several emergency placements. Would you be willing to continue temporary care for another week?" Danielle closed her eyes. She looked at the nearly empty pantry, then toward the children laughing quietly over Ethan's attempt to draw a dinosaur. "Yes. We'll manage." After hanging up, she wasn't entirely sure how. That afternoon, she brought all 3 children to the neighborhood community learning center, where Ethan usually stayed until her diner shift began. The center occupied the basement of an old church. Children colored pictures, read books, and played board games while volunteers supervised. Mrs. Linda Foster, the director, welcomed Danielle warmly. "You've got extra company today." Danielle explained the situation quietly. Linda listened without interrupting. When Danielle finished, the older woman simply nodded. "They're safe here?" For the first hour, everything went well. Then whispers began. A mother standing near the craft table glanced repeatedly towards the twins. Another woman leaned closer. "I've never seen those children before." "Neither have I." "You think they're hers?" "I thought she only had 1 boy." Danielle pretended not to hear. She helped Ethan cut construction paper, while Mason and Mia quietly stacked wooden blocks nearby. The whispers grew louder. "I saw something on television last week about missing twins." "You don't think—" The sentence hung unfinished. Finally, one woman approached directly. She folded her arms. "Excuse me." Danielle looked up politely. "Yes? Those children? What about them? Are they yours?" "No." "So why are they calling you Miss Danielle?" "They're staying with us temporarily." The woman's expression hardened. "Temporarily?" Danielle calmly explained the involvement of police and Child Protective Services. The woman listened with obvious skepticism. "If that's true," she paused, "why haven't they taken the children already?" Before Danielle could answer, Linda Foster stepped between them. "Because the state asked her to help." The room fell silent. Linda's usually gentle voice carried surprising authority. "I've already verified everything. If anyone has further questions," she looked around the room, "please ask me instead of interrogating children." The uncomfortable silence that followed lasted several seconds. The woman muttered an apology and walked away. Danielle quietly thanked Linda. The older woman smiled. "People fear what they don't understand." Then she lowered her voice. "But kindness usually looks suspicious to people who don't practice it." Those words stayed with Danielle all afternoon. By evening, she collected the children and hurried toward Rosie's diner. Rosie had already prepared a small booth near the kitchen. "I figured homework would fit better back here." Ethan grinned. "You read my mind." Rosie noticed the twins. "So these are your little visitors?" She crouched down. "My name's Rosie." No response. Rosie wasn't offended. Instead, she disappeared into the kitchen. Minutes later, she returned, carrying 4 grilled cheese sandwiches cut into perfect triangles. "I accidentally made too many," Danielle smiled knowingly. You planned this? I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Mason hesitated before taking his plate. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at Rosie. Thank you. It was only 2 words, but Danielle almost cried. The children were beginning to trust the world again. That hope lasted until she returned home. A white envelope had been taped to her apartment door. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the landlord. Inside was another notice. Final warning. Payment of $642 must be received within 5 days. Failure to comply will result in legal eviction proceedings. Danielle stood motionless beneath the hallway light. She had paid rent on time for nearly 6 years. One unexpected medical bill after Ethan's broken arm. Several weeks of reduced hours. Higher grocery prices. Everything had slowly caught up with her. She folded the notice before anyone could see. But Ethan had already noticed. Was it another bill? Danielle forced another smile. Just paperwork. He didn't believe her. Children rarely did. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Danielle sat alone at the kitchen table. She opened a notebook. On one page she wrote every expense: rent, utilities, gasoline, school lunches, groceries. There were no unnecessary purchases, no vacations, no restaurant meals, no streaming subscriptions, nothing left to cut. She rubbed her tired eyes. For the first time in years, she wondered if she might actually lose the little apartment that had been Ethan's only real home. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. She turned. Mason stood in the hallway, barefoot, half asleep. He slowly walked toward the window. Without saying a word, he adjusted the 3 paper airplanes so they faced outward toward the parking lot. Then he looked up at the night sky beyond the glass. Daddy knows. He whispered it with complete certainty. Not hope, not wishful thinking. Certainty. Danielle looked from the child to the blue paper airplanes catching the glow of the streetlight. She didn't know how long she could keep food on the table. She didn't know how she would pay the rent. She didn't know whether tomorrow would bring another accusation or another bill. But as she watched the little boy carefully straighten each folded wing before returning to bed, she realized something. Some promises were too precious to break. And until someone came for those children, she intended to keep every promise she had made. By the 2nd week of his search, Samuel Brooks knew every church basement in Cleveland that served free dinners on Tuesday nights. He knew which shelters opened their doors before sunset, and which ones accepted families only after dark. He knew the librarians who quietly set aside children's books for kids with nowhere else to go. He knew the volunteers who remembered faces even when they forgot names. Every evening he wrote the same note in a small leather notebook. No sign of Mason, no sign of Mia. He refused to write the word missing. To Samuel, the twins were not missing. They were simply somewhere he had not reached yet. Long before sunrise each morning, he left Jonathan Carter's estate in a dark gray sedan that attracted little attention. He traded tailored jackets for plain sweaters and baseball caps. Expensive watches stayed locked inside a drawer. Children trusted ordinary people, not men who looked important. One rainy Wednesday, Samuel parked outside St. Matthew's Community Church just before 5 in the afternoon. Every Wednesday, volunteers prepared nearly 200 hot meals for anyone who needed one. No questions, no paperwork, just food. Samuel had visited before, mostly elderly people, a few veterans, some parents between jobs, nothing unusual. He accepted a paper bowl of vegetable stew and quietly took a seat near the back of the fellowship hall. His eyes never stopped moving, not searching aggressively, observing. Children often revealed themselves in ordinary moments. A little boy balancing a spoon like an airplane, a girl swinging her feet beneath an oversized chair. Tiny habits, tiny clues. Half an hour passed. Nothing. Samuel thanked the volunteers and walked toward the parking lot. Just as he reached his car, laughter drifted across the playground beside the church. Not loud laughter. The cautious kind children make after they have remembered how. He turned instinctively. 3 children were playing near an old wooden picnic table. One older boy, a younger boy, a little girl. An African-American woman sat nearby on a weathered bench helping another volunteer hand out fruit cups. Samuel barely glanced at the woman. His attention stayed on the children. The older boy folded a paper napkin into a boat. The younger boy shook his head. Then he reached into his coat pocket. Samuel's heartbeat slowed. The little boy carefully unfolded something blue. Paper. Not a napkin, not a receipt. Blue paper. Tiny hands smoothed each crease with extraordinary care. Then, after checking the breeze, the child launched it into the air. The airplane floated gracefully across the playground. It didn't fly far, just enough to circle once before landing in the wet grass. The little girl laughed. The older boy chased after it. Samuel stood completely still. He had seen that design before, hundreds of times. Not because paper airplanes were unusual, because that particular fold was. Jonathan Carter had invented it one rainy Saturday. Instead of folding the nose sharply, he reinforced the center twice, so small children could throw it without crushing the front edge. He jokingly called it the Forever Flyer. Only 4 of those airplanes had ever existed. Samuel could still picture Jonathan patiently guiding 4 tiny hands around the kitchen table years earlier. He whispered almost without realizing it. "It can't be." The younger boy hurried toward the airplane. He picked it up immediately, before anyone else touched it, exactly the way Mason always had. Samuel felt the hairs on his arms rise. His first instinct was to run, to call Jonathan immediately, to shout. Instead, 23 years of protecting the Carter family took over. He remained exactly where he was. Observe first, act second. The woman on the bench called gently. "Mason, don't go too close to the street." Samuel froze. Mason. The name reached him like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. The little boy turned. "Okay, Miss Danielle." Miss Danielle. Not Mom, not Aunt. Miss Danielle. Samuel slowly exhaled. The woman wasn't pretending. She wasn't coaching the children. She sounded exactly like someone caring for children who weren't her own. He watched another 20 minutes. Nothing looked suspicious. Danielle divided apple slices evenly among the 3 children. She quietly gave her own bottle of water to the little girl after noticing she'd finished hers. The older boy, Ethan Samuel, would later learn took off his hoodie when Mason started shivering, without being asked, without making a big show of it. The children stayed close to Danielle naturally, not fearfully, not obediently, comfortably. When one volunteer accidentally dropped an entire tray of dinner rolls onto the wet sidewalk, Danielle immediately stood to help collect them. Several other adults walked past without noticing. She noticed. Samuel noticed that. Kindness left fingerprints, sometimes clearer than evidence. As dusk settled over the church parking lot, Danielle gathered the children. She checked each coat zipper herself, adjusted Mia's hat, buttoned Mason's jacket, counted quietly. 1. She touched Ethan's shoulder. 2. She squeezed Mason's hand. 3. She smiled at Mia. Everybody's here. Samuel followed at a respectful distance, never close enough to alarm them, never far enough to lose sight. He watched Danielle drive away in an aging silver Honda Civic whose muffler rattled every time it accelerated. He memorized the license plate, then stopped himself. No, that wasn't enough. He wanted to know who Danielle Coleman really was. The next morning, he began asking careful questions. Not about the twins, about Danielle. At Lincoln Elementary, a crossing guard smiled as soon as he mentioned her. "Oh, Danielle. She always brings extra gloves during winter." For kids who forget theirs. At Rosie's diner, he ordered coffee. Rosie wiped the counter. You know Danielle? Samuel asked casually. Rosie grinned. Best waitress I've ever hired. Terrible singer. Excellent human being. Samuel laughed. What makes you say that? Rosie leaned against the counter. She once found $400 in cash under booth 6. My whole staff thought the customer would never come back. Danielle chased his truck 3 blocks through pouring rain. Returned every penny. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. Later that afternoon, he drove past Danielle's apartment building. Nothing remarkable. Old brick, peeling paint, children's bicycles chained near the entrance. Mrs. Evelyn Harper happened to be sweeping leaves near the front steps. Samuel introduced himself as someone interested in renting an apartment nearby. They chatted for several minutes. Eventually, he asked, "What are the tenants like?" Mrs. Harper shrugged. "Most come and go." "But Danielle—" She paused. "I've been trying to evict her." Samuel looked surprised. "Really?" "She fell behind on rent." Another pause. "But she's never lied. Never hid. Every Friday she hands me whatever she can afford. I keep telling myself I'll file the paperwork next week." She looked embarrassed. "I still haven't." Samuel understood immediately. Even the landlord couldn't quite bring herself to remove Danielle. That told him more than any background check ever could. As evening approached, Samuel parked several houses away from Danielle's apartment. He watched quietly from inside the car. The front door opened. Danielle stepped outside carrying a small bag. Ethan followed. Then Mason. Then Mia. 4 people. 1 family at least for now. Before locking the apartment, Danielle looked back inside. She walked to the windowsill, carefully adjusted 3 blue paper airplanes, then turned off the light. Samuel closed his eyes. There was no longer any doubt. The children had been found. The greater surprise was something else entirely. The person protecting them wasn't someone with wealth, influence, or power. She was a single mother who could barely pay her own rent. Yet somehow, against every expectation, she had kept Jonathan Carter's greatest treasure safe. Samuel reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over Jonathan's number. Then he lowered it again. Not yet. Before he brought a grieving father to that apartment, he wanted to be absolutely certain of one thing. He needed to know whether Danielle Coleman had taken those children in, or whether she had opened her heart to them. Samuel Brooks had spent 23 years learning to read people without asking them questions. A driver heard conversations others forgot. He noticed who thanked restaurant servers, who ignored janitors, who looked security guards in the eye, and who walked past them as though they were invisible. Character revealed itself in ordinary moments. That was why he chose not to knock on Danielle Coleman's door. Not yet. If Jonathan Carter's children had survived an entire month under her roof, Samuel wanted to understand why. He parked across the street from Danielle's apartment just after 6 the next morning. The neighborhood was already waking. A garbage truck rumbled slowly down the block. A bakery delivery van stopped on the corner. Parents hurried sleepy children toward waiting school buses. At exactly 6:12 a.m., Danielle stepped outside carrying 4 lunch bags. Not 3, 4. Each bag had a child's name written neatly across the front. Ethan, Mason, Mia, Danielle. She handed Ethan 2 of the bags. "You know the routine." He smiled. "I'll make sure they eat." Samuel watched carefully. The twins automatically reached for Danielle's hands before crossing the parking lot. Not because she asked, because they trusted her. She crouched beside them before they reached the old Honda Civic. "The rule," Ethan answered before either twin could. "We stay together." Danielle laughed. "Good." "What else?" Mason hesitated. Then quietly said, "We tell the truth." And Mia looked up. "We don't leave anybody behind." Danielle nodded. "Exactly." Samuel wrote 3 short lines inside his notebook. No shouting, no fear, consistent routines. Children feel safe. He followed from a distance. The first stop was Lincoln Elementary. Danielle clocked in for her morning cleaning shift while Ethan waited with the twins in the small employee lounge. Mrs. Alvarez, the kindergarten teacher, walked in carrying a box of construction paper. She smiled when she saw the children. "Good morning," Ethan smiled back. "Morning." Mrs. Alvarez crouched beside Mason and Mia. "I brought extra crayons today." She didn't ask personal questions. She didn't force conversation. She simply placed the crayons on the table and returned to decorating her classroom. Samuel noticed something important. People around Danielle behaved kindly. Kind people often attracted other kind people. It wasn't luck. It was trust built over years. Later that afternoon, Samuel drove to Rosie's diner. Instead of sitting near the window this time, he chose a booth where he could quietly observe. Danielle moved quickly between tables. She never wrote orders down. She remembered everything. Coffee without sugar, extra pickles, no onions, refills before customers asked. Rosie wasn't exaggerating. She really was excellent. Near 7 o'clock, an elderly man entered using a walker. Every booth was occupied. Without hesitation, Danielle carried her own dinner break meal into the kitchen and offered him the staff chair near the counter. "You take this one," the man protested. "I don't want to bother you." "You aren't." She smiled warmly. "You'd be bothering me if you stood all evening." Samuel watched her return to work without mentioning what she'd done. No performance, no expectation of praise, only habit. Then something unexpected happened. A sharply dressed woman entered the diner with a teenage boy. She ordered, quickly glanced repeatedly toward Danielle, and finally stood before the register. "I know you." Danielle looked up politely. "I'm sorry." "I saw you at the community center." "The children." Samuel immediately paid closer attention. The dining room seemed to grow quieter. The woman folded her arms. "I've been thinking." Danielle waited. "You say those twins are staying with you?" "Yes." "But how does anyone know they're really lost?" Rosie looked up from the grill. The teenage boy looked uncomfortable. Danielle answered calmly. "Because the police are involved." The woman shrugged. "People lie." Samuel saw several customers stop eating. Rosie took one step forward. Danielle gently shook her head silently, asking her not to interfere. She looked back at the customer. "I understand why you're concerned." The woman seemed surprised by the response. "If those children were yours," Danielle continued softly, "you'd want someone to ask questions too." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Danielle reached beneath the counter. She removed a small folder. Inside were copies of temporary emergency placement documents signed by Child Protective Services. She quietly slid them across the counter. "You don't have to trust me. But I hope you'll trust the people working to bring those children home." The woman read the first page. Her face slowly changed. Embarrassment replaced suspicion. She struggled to find the words. "I'm sorry." Danielle smiled. "It's okay. I'd rather someone worry about children than ignore them." The woman nodded. Before leaving, she quietly placed a $100 bill beneath her coffee cup. Danielle noticed immediately. She hurried after her into the parking lot. "Ma'am." The woman turned. "You forgot your change." "I meant to leave it." "I can't accept that." "It's for the children." Danielle gently held out the money. "If you'd like to help them." She pointed toward a donation box beside the restaurant entrance supporting the local children's shelter. "Please give it there. They're helping dozens of kids." "We're only helping 2. The woman stared at her for several seconds. Then, without another word, she walked back inside and placed the bill into the shelter donation box. Samuel never moved. He simply watched. He had expected kindness. He had not expected integrity that refused easy money. Later that evening, Danielle finally clocked out. The twins were asleep across two pushed-together diner booths, with their heads resting on Ethan's folded jacket. Rosie lowered her voice. "I've got leftovers." Danielle smiled. "I know." Rosie handed her 2 containers. "I also slipped in fresh bread." "You didn't." "I absolutely did." They both laughed. As Danielle loaded the children into the old Honda, Samuel noticed Ethan quietly helping Mason fasten his seatbelt. Not because Danielle reminded him, because he always did. Children copied what they lived with. Kindness had become normal inside that little family. Back at the apartment building, Samuel remained hidden beneath the shade of an old maple tree. Mrs. Evelyn Harper happened to be collecting mail. She waved Danielle over. For a moment, Samuel worried another argument about rent was about to begin. Instead, he saw something entirely different. Mrs. Harper handed Danielle a grocery bag. "My sister bought too much produce." Danielle peeked inside. Fresh apples, potatoes, carrots, celery. "You don't have to—" "I know," the older woman interrupted gently. "But if I keep these, they'll spoil." Danielle smiled knowingly. "Thank you." As she carried the groceries upstairs, Samuel noticed Mrs. Harper quietly wipe tears from the corners of her eyes. Even the landlord had found her own quiet way to help. Samuel sat inside his car for another 15 minutes. He opened his notebook, then slowly crossed out the words he had written the day before. Investigate Danielle Coleman. Below them, he wrote something new. Protect Danielle Coleman. He finally picked up his phone. Jonathan answered on the second ring. "Samuel, I found them." The line went completely silent. Jonathan's breathing became audible. "Mason. Mia. They're alive." A long pause followed. Then came the question Samuel had been expecting. "Are they safe?" Samuel looked toward the apartment window where 3 blue paper airplanes rested on the sill, glowing softly beneath a warm kitchen light. His voice became gentler than Jonathan had ever heard it. "Safer than you could imagine." Jonathan Carter was already halfway to the front door when Samuel's second call stopped him. "Don't leave yet." Jonathan gripped his car keys so tightly that the metal dug into his palm. "You just told me my children are alive." "They are." "And you're asking me to wait for 1 night." Jonathan closed his eyes. "I've waited 31. "I know." Samuel's voice remained steady. "That's exactly why you can't rush the 32nd. Silence filled the line. Finally, Jonathan asked, "Tell me why." Samuel looked toward Danielle Coleman's apartment building from inside his parked sedan. "The woman caring for them doesn't know who they are. She isn't hiding them. She believes she's protecting them." Jonathan's breathing slowed. Samuel continued. "If we arrive with security teams, police vehicles, and reporters—" He let the thought linger. What will she think? Jonathan imagined it instantly. A billionaire arriving unannounced. Lawyers, questions, chaos. The children frightened all over again. He lowered himself back into the chair inside his study. "So, what do you suggest?" "I meet her first." "Alone?" "No cameras. No lawyers. No bodyguards." Jonathan looked toward the framed family photograph on his bookshelf. Mason sat on his shoulders. Mia was laughing beside them, holding one of the blue paper airplanes. "What if she refuses?" Samuel answered immediately. "She won't." "Why are you so certain?" "Because she has spent an entire month saying yes to children who needed her." Jonathan slowly nodded. "I trust your judgment." After the call ended, he remained in the study long after midnight. The mansion around him felt larger than ever. Nearly 12,000 square feet, 8 bedrooms, a wine cellar he hadn't entered in years, an indoor pool that echoed whenever someone walked past. Every luxury seemed strangely empty without children's voices bouncing off the walls. He wandered upstairs. The twins' bedrooms remained untouched. Jonathan had instructed every housekeeper never to change them. Tiny shoes still waited beside the closet. Storybooks remained stacked on the nightstand. A stuffed giraffe sat exactly where Mia had left it. On Mason's dresser stood a photograph from the previous summer. All 4 members of the family were laughing as paper airplanes filled the backyard. Jonathan picked up the frame. His fingers rested against the glass. "I found you." His voice cracked. "I just need one more day." Across town, Danielle knew nothing about the conversation. Her concerns were much smaller, much more immediate. She had exactly $42 in her checking account. Payday was still 3 days away. Mrs. Evelyn Harper's final notice sat beneath the fruit bowl. The twins needed winter boots. Ethan's school field trip required a permission slip and $15. The numbers simply didn't fit together. After breakfast, Danielle spread every bill across the kitchen table. Rent, electricity, gas, phone, insurance. She quietly crossed out anything that could wait. Almost nothing could. Ethan noticed without saying a word. He disappeared into his bedroom. A minute later, he returned, carrying an old glass jar. Inside were quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies collected over years. "I've been saving." Danielle looked at the jar. "No. It's for emergencies. This is one." She smiled sadly. "This is for your bike." "I don't need a bike. You've wanted one for 2 years. I'd rather keep the apartment." Danielle pulled him into a hug. "We're not spending your savings." "Why?" "Because parents don't solve problems with their children's dreams." Ethan didn't argue. He simply placed the jar back on the shelf. But Danielle noticed something later. He quietly removed the price list for bicycles from his bedroom wall. Without a word. Without complaint. That hurt more than any overdue bill. That afternoon, Danielle brought the children to the small neighborhood park before heading to the community dinner at St. Matthew's Church. The playground was nearly empty. Cold autumn wind chased dry leaves across the swings. Mason climbed onto a bench and carefully unfolded all 3 blue paper airplanes. Danielle watched him smooth every crease. He always handled them the same way, never rushing, never bending the wings carelessly, almost like someone handling family photographs. "Can I see one?" Ethan asked. Mason hesitated. Then, for the first time since arriving at Danielle's apartment, he handed one to someone else. Ethan examined it carefully. "Who made these?" "My daddy." "Did he teach you?" Mason nodded proudly. "He says," the little boy smiled. "Good airplanes always know where home is." Danielle quietly turned away before either child saw the tears gathering in her eyes. Somewhere a father had loved his children enough to turn folded paper into hope. She wondered whether he was still searching, whether he blamed himself, whether he had given up. She silently prayed he hadn't. Later that evening, as volunteers served dinner inside St. Matthew's Fellowship Hall, Danielle helped wipe tables after everyone finished eating. An elderly volunteer named Mrs. Louise handed her a paper grocery sack. Someone donated extra canned food. Danielle looked inside. Tomato soup, green beans, pasta, rice, enough to stretch several dinners. "I can't take all this," Mrs. Louise smiled. "You didn't ask." "Exactly." The older woman squeezed Danielle's hand. "That's why you should." Danielle thanked her quietly. She had learned there was dignity in accepting kindness when it allowed you to continue giving kindness to someone else. Outside, hidden beneath the shadow of a large oak tree across the street, Samuel watched once again. He wasn't watching to investigate anymore. He was watching because he wanted Jonathan to understand something before tomorrow. His employer believed he had lost his children. Samuel had discovered something even larger. His children had found another safe heart. that couldn't be barged into with flashing lights and legal documents. It deserved respect. As the families left the church, Danielle noticed an older man standing beside a gray sedan. He looked familiar. Perhaps she had seen him at one of the community dinners. He offered a polite smile. Nothing more. She smiled back. Samuel deliberately kept the encounter brief. No conversation, no questions. He simply wanted Danielle's first impression of him to be calm. Ordinary. Safe. She helped Mia into the Honda. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat. Mason carefully checked that all 3 blue paper airplanes were tucked safely inside his coat pocket before fastening his seatbelt. Samuel watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Then he finally returned to Jonathan's estate. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Jonathan was still awake, still dressed, still waiting. The moment Samuel entered, Jonathan stood. "You saw them again?" Samuel nodded. "How do they look?" "They've gained weight." Jonathan closed his eyes. "Mia." "She's smiling." "Mason." "He still protects his sister?" Jonathan covered his mouth. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Finally he whispered, "Tomorrow." Samuel nodded once. "Tomorrow. But we do this my way." Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes." Samuel looked directly into his employer's eyes. "When I knock on Danielle Coleman's door tomorrow morning..." He paused. "I won't be bringing a billionaire. I'll be bringing a father." Thursday arrived colder than anyone expected. A sharp wind swept through Cleveland before sunrise, carrying the first real bite of late autumn. Danielle Coleman stood in the apartment kitchen wearing her old gray sweater, wrapping aluminum foil around 4 peanut butter sandwiches. She counted them twice. 1 for Ethan, 1 for Mason, 1 for Mia, 1 for herself. Then she quietly slid her own sandwich back into the bread box. If she skipped lunch, there would still be enough food for dinner. She hoped no one would notice. As she zipped Mia's coat, the little girl looked up. "You forgot yours." Danielle smiled. "I'm not hungry today." Before Mia could answer, Ethan spoke from across the room. "My mom says that every time she's hungry." Danielle looked at him. "Ethan," he shrugged. "I'm just telling the truth." The room became quiet. Mason slowly picked up his sandwich and held it toward Danielle. "You can have half." Danielle felt something tighten inside her chest. She gently pushed his little hand back. "I made these for you." "But you didn't make one for yourself." Children noticed everything. She kissed the top of his head. "I'll eat later." The explanation wasn't convincing. Still, neither child argued. Instead, the twins looked at one another with the silent understanding only siblings seemed to share. That afternoon, Danielle received another phone call from Child Protective Services during her break behind Rosie's diner. She stepped into the alley away from the lunchtime noise. "This is Danielle." The social worker sounded exhausted. "I'm sorry to keep asking this." Danielle already knew the question. "You need more time." "Yes. There still isn't a confirmed family match." The investigation continues. Danielle leaned against the brick wall. "How much longer?" "We honestly don't know." A long silence followed. Then the woman added, quietly, "You've done something remarkable." Danielle looked toward the cloudy sky. "I'm just keeping children safe." "I know. But not everyone would." When the call ended, Danielle stared at her phone for several seconds. Temporary. Everything had been temporary. 1 night, then 3 days, then a week, now more than a month. She wasn't afraid of caring for Mason and Mia. She was afraid of failing them. That evening, another envelope waited beneath her apartment door. This one wasn't folded neatly. It had been pushed halfway under the frame by someone impatient. Final eviction notice. Payment due by tomorrow at 5:00 p.m. Failure to pay will result in removal proceedings. Danielle read the letter twice. Her knees felt weak. Tomorrow. Not next week. Tomorrow. She quietly slipped the notice inside her purse before the children came inside. Mrs. Evelyn Harper happened to be climbing the stairs carrying a basket of laundry. She saw Danielle standing motionless in the hallway. "I'm sorry." Danielle looked up. "I know. I tried to delay it. I really did." Danielle nodded. "I believe you." Mrs. Harper sighed heavily. "The bank has been calling me, too. I'm behind on the mortgage. If I don't collect rent—" She stopped speaking. Neither woman needed to finish the sentence. They were standing on opposite sides of the same problem. Neither was the villain. Both were simply trying to survive. That realization somehow made everything sadder. Late that night, after the children had fallen asleep, Danielle opened an old notebook she hadn't touched in years. Inside were lists of goals she had written before Ethan was born. Finish college, become an early childhood educator, open a learning center someday. She smiled faintly. Life had rewritten every plan. Yet somehow she didn't regret choosing Ethan over every unfinished dream. She turned the page. The notebook was almost empty now. Only one blank sheet remained. She wrote today's date. Then beneath it, keep everyone safe until tomorrow. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had. A soft creak interrupted her thoughts. Mia stood quietly in the hallway wearing oversized pajamas that had once belonged to Ethan. "Bad dream." The little girl nodded. Danielle opened her arms. Mia climbed into her lap without hesitation. The trust felt almost unbelievable. A month earlier, the child wouldn't even accept a blanket. Now she rested her head against Danielle's shoulder. After several minutes, Mia whispered, "What happens if we have to leave?" Danielle looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I heard the paper." Children heard more than adults imagined. Danielle brushed a hand gently through the girl's hair. "If we leave—" She searched for honest words. "Then we'll leave together." "Really? As long as I'm responsible for you?" Mia thought about that. Then she asked the question Danielle had feared. "What if Daddy can't find us?" Danielle's eyes drifted toward the windowsill. 3 blue paper airplanes rested there exactly as they did every night. She stood carrying Mia towards the window. Together they looked outside. The parking lot was almost empty. Only a few streetlights remained lit. "You know what I think?" Mia shook her head. "I think your daddy has never stopped looking." "How do you know?" Danielle smiled softly. "Because people who teach children to believe in hope—" She lightly touched one folded wing. "Don't give up easily." Mia reached out and straightened the smallest wrinkle in one airplane. "Daddy says airplanes always come home." "I believe he's right." The next morning began with quiet determination. Danielle dressed for work as usual. She packed lunches. She tied shoelaces. She braided Mia's hair. She reminded Ethan to finish his math worksheet. Nothing about the routine suggested their world might collapse before sunset. As they walked toward the old Honda Civic, Mason suddenly stopped. He looked at Danielle. "If Daddy comes today," he paused, "will you still be here?" Danielle smiled. "I'll always be somewhere cheering for you." The little boy frowned. "That's not the same." "No," she admitted. "It isn't." He reached into his coat pocket. Carefully, he removed the smallest of the 3 blue paper airplanes. Then he pressed it into Danielle's hand. "You keep this." She immediately shook her head. "I can't." "You can." "I have 2 more." Danielle looked at the tiny paper airplane resting in her palm. It was the first time Mason had willingly let anyone else hold one without asking for it back. She folded his fingers gently over it. "No. You keep all 3. They belong together." Mason studied her face. Then slowly he nodded. He placed the airplane back beside the other two. None of them knew it. Only a few blocks away, a familiar gray sedan had already turned onto their street. Behind the wheel, Samuel Brooks took one long breath before parking. For the first time in 31 days, he wasn't there to watch from a distance. He was there to knock. At exactly 8:14 the next morning, 3 gentle knocks echoed through Danielle Coleman's apartment. Not hurried, not demanding, just patient. Danielle assumed it was Mrs. Evelyn Harper coming to ask about the rent before the deadline expired. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the door, her stomach already tightening. When she opened it, an older African-American man stood on the landing wearing a neatly pressed Navy driver's uniform beneath a charcoal overcoat. His posture was straight, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. He removed his cap before speaking. "Good morning, ma'am." Danielle nodded politely. "Can I help you?" Instead of introducing himself, the man looked briefly past her shoulder toward the apartment window. Then he asked quietly, "Do you still have the 3 blue paper airplanes?" Everything inside Danielle seemed to stop. Her first instinct was not relief, it was fear. Her body shifted almost automatically, blocking the doorway. "Who are you?" "My name is Samuel Brooks. I work for someone who has been searching for 2 little children every single day." Danielle's expression remained guarded. "I'm going to need something more than that." Samuel nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. "You should." Behind Danielle, tiny footsteps approached. Mason peeked around the corner. The moment Samuel saw him, emotion flooded his face, but he did not move closer. He knew one wrong step could destroy the trust Danielle had spent a month building. Instead, he smiled gently. "Hello, young man." Mason stared silently. His small hand slipped into Danielle's. Danielle looked down. "It's okay." Then she looked back at Samuel. "How do you know about the airplanes?" Samuel slowly reached inside his coat. Danielle stiffened. He immediately stopped. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you." Very carefully, he pulled out a small leather wallet. From a transparent sleeve inside, he removed something wrapped in a clean white handkerchief. He unfolded the cloth. Resting in the center was a 4th blue paper airplane. Older, slightly faded, but folded in exactly the same unusual pattern. Mason gasped. Mia appeared behind him. Her eyes widened. For the first time since Danielle had met them, both children forgot to hide behind her. Samuel remained where he was. "May I?" He held the airplane out, but didn't step forward. Danielle looked at Mason. "Do you recognize it?" The little boy nodded rapidly. "Daddy." Tears immediately filled Samuel's eyes. He swallowed hard. "Your father kept this one." Danielle felt the hairs on her arms rise. She compared the folds, the reinforced nose, the tiny crease beneath each wing. They were identical, not similar. Identical. Still, she wasn't ready to trust him. Anyone could copy paper. Anyone could invent a story. She looked directly into Samuel's eyes. "If you're telling the truth," her voice stayed calm, "answer something." "I'll try." "What are their names?" Samuel answered without hesitation. "Mason Carter." "Mia Carter." The twins looked at one another, then back at Danielle. Mia whispered, "That's me." Samuel continued softly. "Their father is Jonathan Carter. He made 4 airplanes one rainy Saturday. One for each member of the family." He looked toward Mason. "Your dad always said," before he could finish, Mason quietly completed the sentence. "Good airplanes always know where home is." Samuel covered his mouth. There was no way anyone outside the family should have known those words. Danielle felt her certainty begin to shift, not disappear, but soften. She opened the door a little wider. "You should come inside." Samuel stepped in slowly, careful not to overwhelm the children. The apartment was even smaller than he remembered from watching outside. A tiny sofa, a worn kitchen table, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, 3 lunchboxes drying beside the sink. Nothing expensive. Everything clean. His eyes stopped at the windowsill. 3 blue paper airplanes sat exactly where Jonathan had imagined they would. Perfectly lined up. Samuel walked only halfway across the room before stopping. "I've been looking for those airplanes for 31 days. Danielle folded her arms. "Why hasn't their father come himself?" Samuel's expression grew serious. "Because until yesterday, we weren't certain who had the children. And there was reason to believe the people responsible for their disappearance might still be watching." Danielle frowned. "What happened?" Samuel chose his words carefully. "There was an attempted kidnapping. The details are still under investigation. The safest thing was to approach quietly." He paused. "Without media. Without security. Without frightening the children." Danielle appreciated that answer. It sounded thoughtful rather than rehearsed. Still, she wasn't finished. "Do the police know you're here?" "Yes. So does Child Protective Services. I can give you names. Case numbers. Phone numbers. You don't have to believe me. You can verify everything yourself." He placed a business card and several folded documents on the kitchen table without pushing them toward her. No pressure. No urgency. Just information. Danielle picked up the first page. Official letterhead. Investigation references. Missing children. Photographs. Her breath caught. The smiling faces in the pictures were unmistakable. Mason. Mia. Only happier. Healthier. Standing between a tall African-American man whose arm rested protectively around both children. Jonathan Carter. Danielle looked up slowly. "They've been looking this whole time." Samuel nodded. "Every hour. Every day. He never stopped." Mia quietly walked over. She looked at the photograph, then touched Jonathan's face with one finger. "Daddy." Her voice trembled. "Is he sad?" Samuel couldn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around Danielle's apartment once more, at Ethan's school backpack, at 4 pairs of shoes beside the door, at the almost empty fruit bowl, at the patched curtains, then back at Danielle. "Ma'am." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I've driven Mr. Carter for 23 years. I've seen him negotiate billion-dollar companies. I've seen him bury his wife. I've never seen him as broken." He stopped fighting emotion, as he has been these last 31 days. The apartment fell silent. Even Ethan, who had been listening from the hallway, didn't speak. Finally, Danielle took a slow breath. "I want them to see their father." She looked at Mason and Mia. "But I need one promise first." Samuel nodded immediately. "Anything. No reporters. No cameras. No one treating these children like headlines." Samuel answered without hesitation. "I give you my word." Then Danielle added one more condition. "And until I hear their father tell me himself, I won't let anyone rush them." Samuel smiled through tears. "You sound exactly like the person I hoped had found them." He reached into his pocket and picked up his phone. For several long seconds, he simply stared at Jonathan Carter's name on the screen. Then he pressed the call button. When Jonathan answered almost instantly, Samuel spoke only one sentence. "You can come now." Jonathan Carter reached Danielle Coleman's apartment building in less than 20 minutes. It was the fastest Samuel had ever seen him travel through Cleveland, not because he drove recklessly, because every traffic light seemed to turn green at exactly the right moment. When the black SUV stopped across the street, Jonathan remained inside for several seconds. His hands rested on the steering wheel. They were shaking. Samuel looked over. "You don't have to be Mr. Carter today." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I know. You only have to be Dad." He took one deep breath before opening the door. The autumn air felt colder than he remembered. Across the parking lot stood a weathered brick apartment building with cracked concrete steps and faded paint around the entrance. It was nothing like the homes his children had known, yet for the past month, it had been the place that kept them alive. Jonathan silently thanked it before climbing the stairs. The apartment door was already open. Danielle stood just inside, giving the children room to choose for themselves. She had not pushed them forward. She had not announced that their father had arrived. She simply waited. Jonathan stopped in the doorway. For a long moment, nobody moved. He looked at Mason. The little boy looked taller, thinner. His cheeks had lost some of their roundness. Jonathan's eyes shifted to Mia. She held one of the blue paper airplanes against her chest exactly the way she had always hugged her favorite stuffed rabbit. He wanted to run to them. Instead, he remembered Danielle's request. "Don't rush them." So he slowly lowered himself onto one knee. His voice barely escaped his throat. "Hi, Bug." It had always been his nickname for Mia. The little girl's eyes widened. She whispered almost to herself, "Daddy called me Bug." Jonathan smiled through tears. Then he looked at Mason. "And you?" He swallowed hard. "Captain." Mason stared. Only Jonathan had ever called him Captain because he insisted every paper airplane needed a pilot. The little boy took one hesitant step forward. "Daddy," Jonathan nodded. "I'm here." Another step. "You came." "I told you I would." Mason's lower lip trembled. "I kept the airplanes." "I know. I never stopped looking." The distance between them disappeared all at once. Mason ran. Jonathan caught him with both arms. The force nearly knocked him backward. He buried his face against his son's shoulder and cried without making a sound. Not elegant tears. Not controlled grief. The kind that came from believing something was gone forever, and suddenly finding it breathing in your arms again. A second later, Mia ran too. She threw herself against Jonathan's back. He wrapped one arm around her without letting go of Mason. For several minutes, the only sound inside the apartment was quiet sobbing. Danielle turned away to give them privacy. Ethan quietly slipped his hand into hers. Neither of them spoke. They knew some moments belonged only to the people living them. Eventually, Jonathan pulled back just enough to look at the children. "I've missed you every single day." Mia touched his face carefully. "You have a beard." Jonathan laughed through tears. "I forgot to shave." "You look funny." "I probably do." She smiled. It was the carefree smile of a 4-year-old. The smile Jonathan had feared he might never see again. Then Mason remembered something. Without saying a word, he reached into his coat pocket. He carefully unfolded the 3 blue paper airplanes. One by one, exactly as he had every night at Danielle's apartment. He placed 2 into Mia's hands, then held the 3rd toward his father. "I saved yours." Jonathan stared at the tiny folded airplane. Its edges were worn. One wing had been repaired with transparent tape. Tiny fingerprints marked nearly every fold. He accepted it with trembling hands. "This one," his voice cracked, "came home." He pressed the paper airplane against his heart. No business award, no luxury car, no financial success. Nothing he had ever owned felt as valuable as that worn piece of folded paper. Only then did Jonathan finally look toward Danielle. For several seconds he couldn't find the words. How did someone thank another human being for giving back their children? There wasn't a sentence large enough. He slowly walked toward her. "I don't know." He stopped. "How to thank you?" Danielle shook her head gently. "You don't have to." "I do." "You loved them." She smiled softly. I just made sure they had somewhere safe to wait. Jonathan looked around the apartment. The tiny kitchen, the patched curtains, the old couch where his children had slept, the nearly empty pantry. Then he looked at Danielle again. You had almost nothing. I had enough. You shared everything. Their children. As is Ethan. Jonathan glanced towards the boy. Ethan stood awkwardly near the hallway, unsure whether he should stay or disappear. Jonathan walked over. You must be Ethan. The boy nodded. Thank you for taking care of my brother and sister. Ethan looked surprised. I didn't really do much. Samuel smiled quietly from across the room. Children who had grown up around kindness rarely realized how extraordinary they were. Jonathan crouched beside Ethan. Mason told me you shared your bed. And your jacket. And your toys. Ethan shrugged. They needed them. Jonathan gently rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. You're a very good young man. Ethan smiled shyly. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Mrs. Evelyn Harper stood outside holding a folder. She froze when she saw several unfamiliar people inside. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Danielle immediately recognized the folder. The eviction paperwork. Jonathan noticed it too. Mrs. Harper looked embarrassed. I can come back. Danielle walked over. It's all right. Mrs. Harper lowered her voice. I hate doing this. I know. Before Danielle could say another word, Jonathan quietly asked, Is something wrong? Danielle answered before Mrs. Harper could. It's nothing related to today. It's just rent. She smiled politely, trying to dismiss it. We'll figure it out. Jonathan noticed the words. We'll figure it out. Not you'll fix it. Not can you help. Simply, we'll figure it out. That sentence told him more about Danielle's character than everything Samuel had reported. Mrs. Harper quietly excused herself, promising to return later. When the door closed again, Jonathan turned back toward the children. Mia had climbed onto Danielle's lap, without thinking, without hesitation. Jonathan watched Danielle stroke the little girl's hair exactly the way a mother would. A strange feeling settled inside him. Not jealousy, gratitude. His children had not merely survived, they had been loved. And that realization humbled him more deeply than anything success had ever taught him. As the morning sunlight streamed through the apartment window, it landed on the 3 blue paper airplanes, now resting together in Jonathan's hands. For the first time in 31 days, all 4 airplanes were finally together again. The apartment grew quiet after the tears settled. Not because anyone had run out of emotions, because everyone was trying to understand what came next. Jonathan Carter remained seated on the old sofa with Mason leaning against one shoulder and Mia curled beside him. Every few seconds he reached out, almost unconsciously, to make sure they were really there. Children disappeared from nightmares. He needed to feel that these children would not. Danielle walked into the tiny kitchen. She filled the old kettle and placed it on the stove. There wasn't much she could offer. Only tea. Only warmth. Sometimes that was enough. A moment later, Jonathan appeared beside the doorway. You don't have to do that. She smiled without looking up. I've made tea every difficult day for almost 9 years. I don't know what else to do. He nodded. I understand. For a few moments, they simply listened to the kettle beginning to hum. Jonathan finally spoke. Samuel told me you've been working 2 jobs. Danielle shrugged lightly. Many people do. He also told me you almost lost this apartment. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she poured hot water into 2 chipped mugs. The children don't need to hear adults discussing money. Jonathan accepted the cup she offered. He noticed the crack running down one side of the mug. It had been repaired carefully with food-safe resin instead of being thrown away. Even broken things found another chance in this home. He understood why his children had felt safe here. I owe you more than I can ever repay. Danielle looked directly at him. No. I don't. He frowned. You don't? I didn't take care of Mason and Mia because of who you are. I took care of them because of who they are. Jonathan lowered his eyes. They're children. They needed someone. If I start putting a price on that, she shook her head, then I misunderstand why I opened the door in the first place. Her words lingered between them. Jonathan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removed a checkbook. With practiced movements, he wrote a figure across the paper. Then he carefully tore out the check and placed it on the kitchen table. Danielle glanced down. $500,000. For a second, she honestly thought she had misread the number. Jonathan spoke softly. It won't repay you. Nothing can. But perhaps it can give you and Ethan some peace. Danielle didn't touch the check. Instead, she looked at it for several long seconds. Then she quietly slid it back across the table. Jonathan blinked. You don't have to decide today. I already have. He stared at her. I can't accept this. Why? Because this would make it feel like I was babysitting. You weren't. I know. So don't turn it into that. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. I don't understand. Danielle folded her hands around her warm mug. When Mason woke up crying at 2 a.m, I didn't comfort him because I expected a reward. When Mia caught a fever, I stayed awake because I wanted her to feel safe. When Ethan shared his toys, he wasn't making an investment. She smiled gently. He was making room. The kitchen became silent again. Jonathan slowly folded the check. He placed it back inside his jacket. Not because he had given up, because he finally understood. Money was the wrong language. After several minutes, Danielle spoke again. There is something you can do. Jonathan immediately looked up. Anything. Promise me something. I will. Don't make them feel guilty for surviving. Jonathan frowned. I never would. You might. She looked toward the living room where Mason and Mia were laughing quietly with Ethan over a coloring book. They've smiled here. They've laughed. They've played. They needed to. When they remember this month, I don't want them believing they betrayed you by feeling happy. Jonathan's eyes slowly filled again. He hadn't thought about that, not once. They're children, Danielle continued. They're allowed to heal. They're allowed to trust. They're allowed to love more than one safe adult. Jonathan swallowed hard. Thank you. She smiled. That's the first thing you've said today that I can accept. They both laughed quietly. For the first time since meeting, the conversation no longer felt like one between a billionaire and a struggling single mother. It felt like two parents trying to protect children. A little later, Samuel gently cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, Jonathan turned. We should probably let the police know the children are safe. Of course. Samuel stepped outside to make the necessary calls. Within minutes, Child Protective Services also confirmed that Danielle's emergency placement had officially ended. Everything had happened legally. Everything had happened exactly as it should. Yet the apartment suddenly felt strangely empty. Mia noticed it first. She looked around. Are we leaving now? Jonathan answered honestly. When you're ready. The little girl looked toward Danielle. Can we come back? Danielle's heart skipped. She looked at Jonathan before answering. He smiled softly. If Miss Danielle says yes. Then yes. Mia ran across the room and hugged Danielle tightly. So you won't disappear? Danielle wrapped both arms around her. No. I'll still be here. Mason walked over more slowly. He looked unusually serious. You promised. I know. You said we'd have a home until Daddy came. I did. You kept your promise. Danielle couldn't stop the tears this time. So did your dad. Mason smiled. I told you, Daddy always finds us. Jonathan quietly looked away. He needed a moment to steady himself. A few minutes later, Ethan approached him. He held out a folded piece of notebook paper. I made something. Jonathan unfolded it. It was a child's drawing. 4 stick figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun. One figure wore a suit. One woman had curly hair. 3 children stood between them. Above the picture, Ethan had written carefully, "Everybody found home." Jonathan smiled. It's beautiful. Ethan shrugged. I forgot to draw Mr. Brooks. Samuel laughed from the doorway. I don't mind. Jonathan folded the drawing carefully. May I keep this? Sure. But don't lose it. I won't. I keep important things. Danielle watched the exchange quietly. She realized something then. Jonathan had arrived believing he was coming to take his children home. Instead, he had discovered that home had become larger than one address. Before leaving, Jonathan turned back toward Danielle one final time. I know you won't accept money. She nodded. Not like that. But someday, he paused. If I can offer you an opportunity instead of a reward, would you at least let me ask? Danielle considered the question. Then she smiled. I'll listen. Jonathan returned the smile. For the first time in more than a month, hope no longer belonged only to the Carter family. It had quietly found a place in Danielle Coleman's future as well. 3 weeks passed before Jonathan Carter called Danielle again. Not the next day, not with another check, not with another expensive gift. Samuel had convinced him that gratitude needed room to breathe. Some debts were not meant to be paid quickly. On a chilly Monday afternoon, Danielle was wiping tables after the lunch rush at Rosie's Diner when her phone vibrated inside her apron pocket. The caller ID simply read, Jonathan Carter. She stepped outside into the narrow alley behind the diner before answering. Hello? Hi, Danielle. His voice sounded steadier than it had the day they met. I hope I'm not interrupting. You caught me during my break. Good. There was a brief pause. I'd like to ask you something. She smiled to herself. You remember our conversation? I do. I promised I'd ask before trying to help. I'm listening? Jonathan took a slow breath. Would you meet me tomorrow morning? This isn't about charity. It isn't about money. It's about something I discovered. Danielle hesitated. What time? 9 o'clock? I'll send Samuel. She almost laughed. I think I trust Samuel by now. So do my children. The next morning, Samuel arrived exactly on time. His gray sedan looked much less intimidating now than it had the first day he appeared outside Danielle's apartment. Ethan climbed into the back seat beside Mason and Mia, who had insisted on visiting after school. The 4 children had spent nearly every weekend together since the reunion. The bond formed during those 31 difficult days had never disappeared. As the car drove through downtown Cleveland, Danielle looked out the window. I thought we were going to Jonathan's office. Samuel smiled. We're not. 20 minutes later, they stopped in front of an old red brick building that had once been an elementary school. The sign above the entrance had been removed years earlier. Several windows were boarded up. The playground stood empty. Jonathan waited near the front steps wearing jeans and a navy sweater instead of a business suit. He greeted Danielle with a warm smile. Thanks for coming. She looked around. What is this place? It used to be Maple Grove Early Learning Center. It closed 4 years ago. She nodded. I remember reading about it. Jonathan led her inside. Dust floated through the sunlight, pouring from tall windows. Empty classrooms stretched down a long hallway. Small hooks for children's backpacks still lined the walls. One room still had faded alphabet letters painted above an old chalkboard. Danielle instinctively walked inside. She ran her fingertips lightly across a tiny reading corner where colorful rugs had once covered the floor. Without realizing it, she smiled. "You've been imagining where the books would go." Jonathan's voice startled her. She laughed quietly. Was it that obvious? "You've been looking at every room like it isn't empty." She looked around again. "I suppose I have." Jonathan reached into a leather folder. He carefully removed a transcript. "I asked someone to look into your background." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "I hope that doesn't sound intrusive." "It depends what you found." He handed her the papers. They were copies of college records from more than 9 years earlier. Cuyahoga Community College. Associate Program in Early Childhood Education. Completed credits 52. Program incomplete. Reason for withdrawal, family responsibilities. Danielle stared silently at the page. "I haven't seen this in years." "You were 1 semester away." She nodded. "Ethan was born." "I couldn't afford tuition anymore." "So you never finished?" "No." Jonathan looked around the abandoned classroom. "I spoke with your former professor." She blinked. "You did?" "Professor Helen Morris." Danielle smiled immediately. "She still teaches." "Part-time." Jonathan smiled. "She remembers you." "What did she say?" He opened another folder. Instead of reading directly, he looked at Danielle. "She said," he smiled, "that you were the student most likely to make every child feel like they mattered." Danielle lowered her eyes. Professor Morris had written that sentence in one of her assignments years ago. She had completely forgotten. Jonathan continued. "She also said something else." "What?" "Danielle never wanted a job. She wanted children to feel safe." The old classroom suddenly felt very quiet. Jonathan walked toward the dusty windows. "I've been thinking ever since I left your apartment. I offered you money. You refused. I offered gratitude. You accepted. I kept asking myself why." He turned back toward her. "Then Samuel said something." Danielle glanced toward the older driver. Samuel smiled. "I told him you didn't need rescuing. You needed a chance." Jonathan nodded. "Exactly." He placed another folder into Danielle's hands. "This building belongs to one of my foundations. It has been empty for years." She looked confused. "I'm not giving it to you." She smiled. "I assumed not." "I'm offering something different." He opened the folder. Inside was a scholarship agreement. Full tuition, books, childcare assistance, flexible internship placement. Everything required to finish her degree. Danielle read every page slowly. Her hands began trembling. "This..." She stopped. "This is for me." Jonathan nodded. "On one condition." She looked up cautiously. "What condition?" "You finish what you started. No shortcuts. No honorary certificates. You attend classes. You complete every assignment. You earn every credit." Danielle kept staring at the papers. "You really expect me to go back to school at 33? Jonathan smiled. "I expect you to become the educator Professor Morris believed you already were." She laughed softly through unexpected tears. "I haven't written a research paper in almost a decade." "Then you'll write another." "I work 2 jobs. We've already spoken with Rosie's diner." Danielle looked surprised. "You talked to Rosie?" A familiar voice echoed from the doorway. "I sure did." Rosie stepped inside carrying 2 coffee cups. She handed one to Danielle. "I've already hired another waitress for your evening shifts." Danielle stared at her. "You what?" Rosie shrugged. You've covered for everyone else for years. It's about time somebody covered for you." Danielle laughed and cried at the same time. "I can't believe all of you planned this." Samuel grinned. It took some coordination. Jonathan spoke gently. "This isn't charity. This is an investment. In someone who has already proven exactly who she is." Danielle looked around the empty classrooms once more. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine children filling the halls again. Story time, finger painting, tiny backpacks, laughter, hope. She slowly closed the folder, then looked directly at Jonathan. "I'll accept this." He smiled. "But only because you're giving me an opportunity." She paused. "Not a reward." Jonathan extended his hand. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." Danielle shook it. Outside the classroom window, Ethan Mason and Mia chased one another across the old playground, laughing as Samuel pretended he couldn't catch them. For the first time in many years, Danielle realized she wasn't looking backward at the life she had lost. She was looking forward to the one she still had time to build. 2 years passed more quickly than Danielle Coleman ever imagined. The old Honda Civic still started with a reluctant cough every morning, but she no longer drove it from one exhausting job to another. Instead, every weekday at 8:00 a.m., she parked beneath a newly painted sign that read, "Paper Wings Family Resource Center." The building had once been Maple Grove Early Learning Center. Now sunlight-filled classrooms that had stood empty for years. Fresh paint covered the faded walls. Children's artwork hung where cracked bulletin boards had once collected dust. The old reading corner Danielle had noticed on her first visit had become the busiest place in the building. Every afternoon, children gathered there with volunteers who read stories about courage, friendship, and hope. Danielle had kept one promise to herself. Nothing inside the center would feel expensive. It would feel welcoming. Small wooden shelves replaced locked glass cabinets. Soft rugs covered the floors. Every child who walked through the front door was greeted by name. Every parent was offered coffee before paperwork. Every family was treated with dignity before questions. Professor Helen Morris attended Danielle's college graduation the previous spring. When Danielle crossed the stage to receive her diploma in early childhood education, Ethan had been the first person to stand and applaud. Mason and Mia cheered so loudly that the audience laughed. Jonathan had quietly wiped away tears beside Samuel. None of them had forgotten how impossible that moment had once seemed. Now Danielle served as director of family programs at the center. The title sounded impressive. Her daily work did not. She still knelt on classroom floors tying children's shoes. She still wiped tears after scraped knees. She still stayed late to clean spilled paint when the custodial staff called in sick. Titles never changed the work she loved. One Wednesday morning, a nervous young mother entered, carrying a sleeping toddler. She hesitated just inside the entrance. "I don't think I belong here." Danielle walked over with her familiar smile. "That's usually how everyone feels the first time." The woman looked embarrassed. "I lost my apartment last month. We're staying in my sister's basement. I'm not looking for charity." Danielle gently handed her a warm cup of coffee. "Neither are we." The young mother frowned. "What do you mean?" "We don't hand out pity. We build plans." The woman looked around. Children laughed in nearby classrooms. Volunteers sorted donated books. A counselor quietly spoke with another father whose work hours had been reduced. Everything felt busy, normal, human. Danielle remembered standing in her own kitchen with overdue rent notices spread across the table. She remembered believing her life had become smaller. Now she understood something different. Sometimes hardship simply introduced you to people you would never have met otherwise. Near lunchtime, Samuel Brooks arrived carrying 3 large pizza boxes. The receptionist laughed. "You know today's not Friday." Samuel smiled. "I know." But Mason insisted today's math test deserved a celebration. He had become a familiar face at the center. Children no longer called him Mr. Brooks. To them, he was simply Grandpa Sam. He pretended to dislike the nickname. No one believed him. Danielle met him near the front desk. "You spoil them." "I've earned the right." "I suppose you have." He glanced toward the playground outside. Ethan, now 10 years old, was helping Mia climb the monkey bars while Mason timed them both with a stopwatch. "They still act like siblings." "They are," Danielle answered without hesitation. "Not by blood, but in every way that matters." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. Jonathan arrived shortly afterward. Unlike many donors, he never announced his visits. No photographers accompanied him. No press releases followed. Most of the children assumed he was simply another volunteer because he spent more time building toy blocks than giving speeches. That afternoon, he found Danielle sitting on a bench, watching the playground. "You've changed this place." She smiled. "So have a lot of other people." "You know what I mean." Jonathan looked across the yard. Several parents chatted while waiting for dismissal. A counselor helped one father complete a job application. 2 retired teachers tutored children beneath a maple tree. This isn't just a center anymore. It's a community. Danielle laughed softly. That's because communities are built by people who stay. Jonathan sat beside her. "Do you ever think about that first night?" She looked toward the parking lot. "More often than you'd think. I still remember the rain. I remember opening my door. I remember wondering why those children chose my apartment." Jonathan smiled. "I've wondered the same thing." They sat quietly for a while. Finally, he asked, "Have you ever figured out the answer?" Danielle watched Ethan hand Mia her backpack before checking that Mason hadn't forgotten his jacket. Then, all 3 children waited together instead of running ahead. The same rule she had taught them years earlier still lived inside them. "Nobody gets left behind." She smiled. "I don't think they chose my apartment. I think kindness did." Jonathan considered those words. "I used to believe success meant building companies. And now, I think success is building people." Late that afternoon, the center prepared to close. Parents arrived one by one. Children hurried into waiting arms. Laughter slowly faded from the hallways. Before leaving, Mason walked into Danielle's office carrying a small blue envelope. "I made something." She opened it. Inside was a carefully folded blue paper airplane. Not one of the originals, a new one. "I folded it myself." He smiled proudly. "Perfectly." Danielle examined the neat creases. "It really is." Mia handed her another. "So you won't run out." Ethan laughed. "We're going to need a lot of blue paper." Jonathan watched quietly from the doorway. He noticed Danielle place the new airplanes beside the original 3, now protected inside a simple wooden display case in her office. No expensive glass, no alarm system. Just a handwritten card beneath them. "Hope always knows the way home." Samuel smiled when he read it. He remembered the frightened little boy who had whispered those words beneath a rain-soaked porch. Now that same child laughed freely with 2 people who had become family without ever sharing a last name. As the sun settled behind the trees outside, Danielle switched off the lights 1 classroom at a time. The building slowly became quiet. But unlike 2 years earlier, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. Tomorrow morning, children would return. New stories would begin. New families would need hope. And Danielle Coleman would once again be waiting at the door, ready to open it. 3 years after 2 frightened children appeared outside Danielle Coleman's apartment, carrying 3 blue paper airplanes, nearly every chair inside the auditorium at Paper Wings Family Resource Center was filled. Teachers sat beside firefighters. Social workers chatted with police officers. Families who had once received help now volunteered at the registration tables. Some had driven from neighboring counties simply to attend the dedication ceremony. A new program was about to begin. Above the stage hung a simple banner. Paper Wings Initiative, no corporate logos, no photographs of donors, only a single blue paper airplane folded from paper and suspended by nearly invisible thread. Danielle had insisted on that. The story was never about us, she had told the planning committee. It was always about hope. Backstage, Ethan adjusted his tie for what felt like the 10th time. Now 13 years old, he had grown taller than Danielle's shoulder. "You've checked it enough." "I know. I'm nervous. You've spoken in front of people before." "Not this many," Danielle smiled. "You'll be fine." Mason walked over carrying a small wooden box. He was older now, but he still handled it with exactly the same care he had once used when protecting 3 fragile paper airplanes. "You ready?" Ethan nodded. "I think so." Mia appeared moments later wearing a light blue dress. She quietly slipped her arm through Danielle's. "I had the dream again." Danielle looked at her. "The porch?" Mia nodded. "The rain. And then you opened the door." Danielle gently squeezed her hand. "What happened after that?" Mia smiled. "This time I wasn't scared." Jonathan approached just in time to hear those words. He placed one hand lightly on Mia's shoulder. "You'll never have to be again." The ceremony began at 10 o'clock. The mayor welcomed everyone briefly before stepping away from the podium. Professor Helen Morris spoke next. She looked toward Danielle. "I once wrote in a student's evaluation that she wanted children to feel safe." She smiled warmly. I had no idea she would spend the rest of her life proving it. The audience applauded. Rosie Miller wiped tears from her eyes. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, now comfortably retired after selling her apartment building and moving closer to her grandchildren, clapped louder than anyone. Samuel Brooks remained quietly near the back of the room, exactly where he preferred to be. Jonathan eventually stepped to the microphone. Unlike the polished keynote speeches he delivered at business conferences, this one consisted of only a few handwritten pages. "I've been introduced many ways." He looked across the audience. "CEO. Founder. Entrepreneur." He smiled softly. "My favorite introduction happened 3 years ago." He paused. It was simply, "Daddy." The room became silent. "My children came home because one woman opened a door instead of asking questions first." He looked toward Danielle. "She didn't know our names. She didn't know what we could give her. She only knew 2 children were cold." His voice became quieter. "I spent years believing success meant solving problems. Danielle taught me that sometimes success begins with sitting beside someone until they can solve them themselves." The applause lasted several seconds. Jonathan stepped away from the podium. Then he invited Danielle forward. She shook her head slightly. He smiled. "You can't hide today." The audience laughed gently. Danielle stood before the microphone. She took a slow breath. "I've spent my whole life thinking I wasn't extraordinary." She looked toward the families filling the room. "I still don't think I am. I think ordinary people change lives every day. The cashier who smiles. The bus driver who waits 10 extra seconds. The neighbor who brings groceries without making someone feel ashamed. The teacher who remembers a child's name." She glanced toward Ethan. "The little boy who shares his only bed." Then toward Mason and Mia. "The children who never stopped believing someone was coming." She smiled. "Hope is rarely loud. Most of the time, it knocks softly." When she stepped away, Mason carried the small wooden box onto the stage. He carefully opened it. Inside rested the original 3 blue paper airplanes. Time had faded their color slightly. Tiny repairs were still visible along one wing. The audience leaned forward. Mia picked up the first airplane. She walked down from the stage and stopped beside a little boy, no older than 5. He had arrived at the center only 2 days earlier after being separated from his grandmother during a severe apartment fire. The child had barely spoken since. Mia knelt in front of him. "This one's for you." The little boy looked uncertain. "I can't keep it." "You can." "It helps." "How?" Mia smiled. "It reminds you." She gently placed the airplane into his hands. "That someone is already looking for tomorrow." The little boy carefully accepted it. His fingers closed around the paper exactly the way hers once had. Danielle felt tears gather again. The circle had finally closed. Not because the story had ended, because it had begun again for someone else. After the ceremony, families filled the courtyard outside. Children folded blue paper airplanes at long craft tables. Volunteers helped grandparents learn the pattern. Police officers laughed with preschoolers. Firefighters competed to see whose airplane flew farther. Samuel sat quietly beneath a maple tree, watching it all. Jonathan joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You staying in the background again?" Samuel accepted the cup. "It's where I'm most useful." Jonathan looked across the lawn. Danielle was helping the little boy launch his paper airplane into the afternoon breeze. It glided above the courtyard before circling gently back toward the grass. Children chased after it, laughing. Jonathan smiled. "You know, if you hadn't stopped me that day," Samuel finished the sentence, "you would have arrived as a billionaire." Jonathan nodded. "And I would have missed meeting the woman who saved my family." The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the center. Before locking the front doors that evening, Danielle walked into her office. The original 2 paper airplanes that Mason and Mia had chosen to preserve rested inside their wooden display case. The third no longer belonged there. It had already begun another journey. She smiled. Perhaps that was exactly how hope was supposed to work. Never locked away, always passed forward. She switched off the office light, glanced once more at the handwritten words beneath the display case, and quietly closed the door. Hope always knows the way home. Every life will eventually place us on one side of a closed door. Sometimes we are the ones hoping someone will open it. Other times we are the ones holding the key. Danielle never had wealth, influence, or certainty. She simply chose compassion before convenience. That single decision changed not only the lives of 2 frightened children, but also a father, a son, an entire community, and countless families who would come after them. Real kindness is rarely dramatic. It often looks like sharing a meal when the pantry is almost empty, offering a safe place to sleep, listening without judgment, or believing in someone long before they believe in themselves. Money can solve immediate problems, but genuine opportunity restores dignity. And dignity has the power to transform generations. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to think about someone who once opened a door for you. Perhaps today is the perfect day to become that person for someone else. A small act of kindness may be remembered for a lifetime, even if you never know the ending. Thank you for spending your time with us. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with someone who believes that compassion still matters. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What moment moved you the most? And what would you have done if you had opened that door on that rainy night? Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories about courage, hope, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people.